Another lesson the McCain campaign is learning today: when you're running on a decades-long record, dramatically changing a staunchly held position that you had for all those decades doesn't go unnoticed. Amid the current economic meltdown, Senator McCain is calling for regulation in Washington and on Wall Street.
Under my reforms, the American people will be protected by comprehensive regulations that will apply the rules and enforce them to the fullest.
Sounds a little like what Barack Obama was saying back in March when he outlined a plan for revamping the regulatory system. But John McCain, a man who once supported a moratorium on almost all federal regulations, he's been in Washington for 26 years. And he's only supported increased regulation now for about 26 hours. The New York Times, calling him out today, said, quote, "John McCain has sold himself to many voters as an agent for change despite his party's unpopularity after years of dominating in Washington and despite his own anti-regulation stances of past years." We would like to have welcomed a McCain campaign representative to address today's news, but our requests for top economic advisor Carly Fiorina, senior policy advisor Douglas Holtz-Eakin, or national co-chair Meg Whitman found them all unavailable. We do sincerely hope that they'd be able to join us another time soon. Joining us now that I've sort of made him feel like a second choice, and I'm sorry for that, is syndicated columnist David Sirota, who's known for his outside the Beltway coverage of politics and economic issues. You know I mean it in the best way, right, David?
I do. I don't take it personally.
All right. The New York Times says that John McCain seems to be, quote, scrambling to adjust his position on regulation to the current political climate. What has been John McCain's position on regulation, on regulating business, regulating the markets?
Well, John McCain's own words, he says, "I'm fundamentally a deregulator." That's a direct quote. And he says that I'm always for less regulation. This is a person who's a Reagan conservative, an ideological conservative who is against regulation. So for him to now run out there and say that he's suddenly the guy who's going to regulate the economy and regulate Wall Street is beyond absurd. And I think we have to look at his history. Let's remember that McCain's formative economic experience was in the last crisis, the S&L crisis, where he was one of the Keating Five. In that scandal, he was somebody who used his Senate position to effectively intervene and press regulators to not get involved and regulate that scandal.
Well, is there a risk, as this economic debacle that we're involved in right now starts to resemble the S&L scandal, that the Keating Five issue is actually going to be on the table? Obama and Biden have stayed away from it thus far. Some outside groups have touched on it in a very minor way, but I think 99 out of 100 Americans would have no idea what the Keating Five was or what John McCain's role was in it.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. I mean, I think older Americans might remember the S&L scandal. I think explaining that McCain was involved in that scandal, used his office in that scandal, again, to press regulators to get out of that scandal, to not essentially regulate the financial industry, it's completely relevant. It's completely important because it's the last example that we have. It's actually the only example that we have of what John McCain would do with a public office with a crisis like this.
David, what is the biggest barrier to better oversight of Wall Street and the financial firms? What has stopped there being good oversight in recent years? What is it that needs to change?
Well, first and foremost, there's a huge amount of money going into both parties from Wall Street, and that tends to buy the policies behind the rhetoric, or the lack of policies behind the rhetoric. So what we all should be watching for is not what the candidates, both of them, are saying, but what they're actually specifically proposing. Because money, again, huge amounts of money. Barack Obama's taken $9.8 million from Wall Street. McCain has taken $6.8 million from Wall Street. The question is, what are they going to specifically propose? That's the real question.
It also helps to note that lobbyists for AIG, Merrill Lynch, Lehman Brothers, and Bank of America are all on John McCain's campaign staff, whereas Barack Obama, as far as I know, doesn't have any lobbyists working as paid staff for him. That seems salient at this point, too.
That's absolutely true. And remember, John McCain's top economic advisor, or at least was, and still an advisor of his, Phil Gramm, is the guy who pushed through legislation through the Senate to essentially gut the Depression-era regulations that would have prevented or at least lessened the impact of this financial crisis today.
Syndicated columnist David Sirota, thank you so much for joining us.